Speech communication is defined as the study of human interaction and its use of verbal and nonverbal symbols to impact different communicative phenomena. Thus, we don't want to miss studying both verbal and nonverbal communication, especially when we study interpersonal and intrapersonal communication or human interactions. In this video, we will talk about language and identify nonverbal cues and discuss how these contribute to the world of communication. Are you ready? Let's begin. So let us try to understand verbal communication first. So language or verbal communication shapes how we perceive the world. Language is also primary means by which we present ourselves and build relationships with others. So when we use language, we not only express our identity, but we also use it to communicate with other people and create and form relationships. So let's look at the symbolic nature of language. We have three. First is that symbols are arbitrary. So it means that the words are not intrinsically connected to what they represent. And because of this, the meanings of words or symbols change over time. So it is also dynamic and it allows us to invent new words. Next is that symbols are ambiguous, and it means that there is no guarantee that people will agree on what words mean. Some say that this object can be a tree, but this object can also be a house. So it depends on both peoples and it depends on their context. Because of this, it can lead to misunderstandings between different people, especially if they have different backgrounds or contexts. And finally, symbols are abstract, and it means that they are not concrete or tangible. So take note that even though words stand for ideas, people, events, objects, feelings, or other things, it doesn't necessarily mean that words represent those things. And like we said earlier, symbols are ambiguous. So the more we use abstract language, the more the conversation becomes unclear to us. So what is the solution? Let's make our conversations concrete and define what we mean on what we say. So, how do language works? Let us look at some key principles of verbal communication. First is that language and culture reflect each other. So, communication reflects cultural history, values, and perspectives. And it also creates or reproduces culture by naming and normalizing practices valued by that culture. Communication also changes cultures by naming things in ways that alter understandings. An example of this is that language and communication are tools that social movements use to change cultural life and meanings. Next is that the meanings of language are subjective. So we construct meanings in the process of interacting with others and through dialogues we carry on in our own heads. So the way we talk, the way we speak, and the way we put our messages depends on what we think. So the messages we speak depends on us, on our context, and how we see the world. In other words, the meanings of our messages depends on us and how we define those meanings depending on our context. Next is that language use is rule guided. So communication rules are shared understandings of what communication means and what kinds of communication are appropriate in particular situations. Next is that punctuation shapes meaning. So in writing, we use commas, periods, and semicolons to define where ideas stop and start and where pauses are needed. Similarly, in interpersonal communication, punctuation defines beginnings and endings of interaction episodes. So to punctuate communication, we define when interaction begins and who starts it. When we don't agree on punctuation, misunderstandings may arise. So now we understand some of the features of verbal communication. Now let's go to nonverbal communication. We define nonverbal communication as aspects of communication other than words. So it includes not only gestures, and body language, but also how we utter words. So it also involves inflection, pauses, tone, volume, and accent. Nonverbal communication also includes features of environments that affect interaction, personal objects such as jewelry and clothes, and physical appearances. Now let us look at some principles or features of nonverbal communication. First is that nonverbal communication may supplement or replace verbal communication. What does this mean? Nonverbal behaviors may repeat verbal messages, or nonverbal behaviors may highlight verbal communication, such as nodding your head instead of saying yes. It may also complement or add to words, such as using my hand gestures to emphasize what I'm saying. Nonverbal behaviors may contradict verbal messages, such as saying yes but using a hesitant tone. Nonverbal behaviors are often used as substitute for verbal cues. Next is that nonverbal communication may regulate interaction. Taking turns in conversations usually are regulated nonverbally. Next is that nonverbal communication often establishes relationship level meanings. So, nonverbal communication often acts as a relationship language that expresses the overall feeling of relationships. It can be conveyed through three dimensions of relationship level meaning: responsiveness, liking, and power. In face to face interactions, immediacy behaviors include smiling or making eye contact, nodding your head, or making an attentive posture. Online, we may communicate responsiveness by using emojis or emoticons to convey our feelings and by replying immediately to an instant messages or to comments in a chat room. Synchronicity or harmony between people's postures and facial expressions may reflect how comfortable they are with each other. Nonverbal behaviors often are key indicators of how positively or negatively we feel towards others. Smiles and friendly touching convey positive feelings, while frowns and belligerent postures express antagonism. The third dimension of relationship level meaning is power. We use nonverbal behaviors to assert dominance and to negotiate for status and influence. Next is that nonverbal communication reflects and expresses cultural values. Most nonverbal behaviors that we communicate are not actually instinctive or inherent, but are actually learned in the process of being socialized within a particular culture or social group. We now look at some types of nonverbal communication. First is kinesics, or the body position and body motions, including those of the face. Actually, humans communicated by gesture long before they learned to communicate through language. We use gestures to emphasize verbal language and also to express feelings. Next is haptics, or the sense of touch. Research shows that touching and being touched are essential to a healthy life. So, touching also communicates power and status. Next is physical appearances and artifacts. So, cultures vary in their idea and value of physical appearances. In Western cultures, they highly value physical appearances and beauty, while the Japanese culture see people with crooked teeth as beautiful. So the definition of beauty here is varied depending on cultures or contexts. But one thing is common to these cultures, and that is to craft our image by our hairstyles, makeup, dress, and personal objects. Next is environmental factors, or the elements of settings that affect how we feel and act. For instance, we respond to architecture, colors, room design, temperature, sounds, smell, and lighting. So sometimes it affects our mood, sometimes it affects our productivity, and sometimes it affects what we will respond to the person we're talking to. Next is proxemics, or personal space. So every culture has norms that prescribe how people should use space, how people should be close to one another, and how much space different people are entitled to have. So, how people arrange space reflects how close they are and whether they want interaction. and this varies according to different cultures. Next is chronemics, or how we perceive and use time. The length of time we spend with different people reflects our interpersonal priorities. Sometimes we spend the whole day with them. Sometimes we spend less time with them. And that shows how we prioritize our relationships with those people. Paralanguage is communication that is vocal but does not use words, such as murmurs or gasps, and the use of vocal qualities such as volume, pitch, and inflections and accents, pronunciations, and complexity of sentence. Sometimes we will raise our voice while we're talking, and that means something when we talk with other people. Sometimes we whisper, and that also says something. And finally, we have silence. Silence can communicate powerful messages. We use silence to communicate different meanings. For instance, it can symbolize contentment when intimates are so comfortable they don't need to talk. Silence can also communicate awkwardness. Silence can be yes, or silence can be no, depending on the situation. In some cultures, including many Eastern ones, silence indicates respect and thoughtfulness. These features are important to know and understand because they will aid us in being effective communicators. These things will help us what to say and how we will deliver it. And it will give us options on which ones to choose so that we may communicate to another person appropriately. I hope that we may be able to use verbal and nonverbal communication features in our everyday interactions and be effective communicators.